So this lecture burst also goes along with chapter 8, and it deals with conformity as being a part of social influence. So conformity by its very nature violates our personal freedom, but it also maintains social order. Conformity is social influence in which we change our behaviors to be consistent with the social norms that we covered and talked about in the last lecture burst. So it's adhering to those social norms or unwritten rules regarding behavior. And it's largely driven by the expectations to do so, the expectations that we follow, that we conform to what other people are doing, or just simply the pressure to fit in with what other people are doing. So a great example would be singing the national anthem. It's sort of like the expectation of what we do at ball games. Everyone does it. So there's a little bit of pressure to fit in. There's also the expectation that you would do it. So you're adhering to this norm, even though it's not a law, it's not written anywhere that you have to do that when you go to a ball game. It's an unwritten rule regarding behavior. One could choose not to conform, stating that it violates their personal freedom, as we've seen with the take a knee kind of movement that was happening. And so, by its nature, conformity does violate personal freedoms. And today, a lot of people are self-proclaimed nonconformists, but it's kind of interesting because we need conformity to maintain social order. If everyone did whatever they want, whenever they wanted, and everyone played by their own rules, we would have complete chaos and anarchy. So we can't really do that as a society to get along. We have to have a certain level of conformity, or else it just doesn't work very well. So one of the big names in the field of conformity research is Solomon Asch, and he did the famous line judging task. You can watch the video about this in the videos for this week that I've posted for you guys on Plato. But Asch basically had confederates in his experiment. So confederates are people that know what the experiment is about. They're actors, they're playing along. And then he'd have one participant in the experiment that didn't know what was going on. And he would present all of those individuals with the following diagram. And he would say, compare lines A, B, and C to line X and identify which one matches line X. Seems pretty simple and pretty straightforward. However, Asch set the experiment up in such a way that the confederates were the ones that gave their answers first, and he always had at least a few of them go before it got to the actual participant. And what the confederates would do is they would give the wrong answer. They would say, oh, I think it's C. And then the next one would say, yeah, C for me too. And then C. And then it gets to the participant. And now a dilemma is set up in the mind of the participant because they look at that and, like anyone, would clearly say, well, it's not C, it's B. But why did everyone say C? And what he found is that the majority of participants would conform with what was already said, and they would too also agree that it was C against their better judgment, that it was really B. And so what he found was a really interesting thing, is that people, even when they knew better, they conformed to the norm against their better judgment. So confederates were used along with one subject. They always answered first, purposely chose the wrong answer, and the subject or the participant in the study was then faced with social consensus that contradicted their own eyes, the social consensus being the wrong answer. And so the majority of participants went along with that wrong answer. So in fact, 75% of participants gave the wrong answer as well. And in the control condition, where it's just normal people giving normal answers, 95% got the matches right. What were the other 5% doing? I don't know. But that is his original study, and that's been replicated time and time again. So that brings us to the question, why might we choose to conform? If we know something's wrong, or we know something's not right or inaccurate, why then do we choose to conform? What are some of the social forces or influences around that? And here's where we get into factors that strengthen conformity. Here's what kind of needs to be in place in order for conformity to be more likely to happen. So one might be made to feel incompetent or insecure. If you're in a situation where you don't know a lot about what's going on, you're not a good judge of what's happening perhaps, you might feel incompetent. Or you might be around really highly respected or regarded others, like a peer group that you really admire and you want to be a part of. You might be made to feel insecure. These would be factors that would pressure you to be more likely to conform. When the group has at least 3 people, we're more likely to conform. And in fact, Ash found that when he used only 1 or 2 Confederates, people were much less likely to conform and go along with their wrong answer. It had to have at least 3. 3 was kind of the magic number. The group also needs to be unanimous. So conformity doesn't happen when some people think one thing and another people think another thing and then yet another group thinks something else. That's kind of division and people don't have a standard to follow. So when a group is unanimous and there's a clear direction that gives a consensus for the majority of the group, that's going to strengthen conformity. When we admire the group's status and the group is attractive, we want to be a part of this group, it matters to us, we're going to conform more. When we've had no prior commitment to a response, when we've not already made any responses, judgments, or decision making, we're more likely to just go along with what the group is doing. And when the group observes our behavior. Ash found that when individuals made their choices of the line study in private, they didn't go along with the group's behavior. Even though they heard other people's answers, if they were in a room alone, writing down their own answer, they were less likely to comply. But there's something about being amongst the group that all give the wrong answer that puts the pressure on more for that person to conform. And when one's culture strongly encourages a respect for a social standard like conformity, we're going to conform more. And we see this in cultures like China, where it's collectivistic and people usually do what's best for the good of the group. And then lastly, the cohesiveness of the group. The stronger the members are of a particular group and the closer I feel to those members, I'm not going to want to break that up. So I'm going to go ahead and conform, maybe even in situations when I don't feel like I should or like I want to. There's also characteristics of the group that affect conformity, like how many are in the in-group. If the in-group is seen as popular and is large, that's going to affect our decisions to conform. Like Ash found, 3 Confederates maximized conformity. And this sort of relates to social impact theory, where it says that conformity is going to go ahead and depend on the strength, the immediacy, and the number of people in the in-group, the group that you're identifying with and you're placing yourself within. There's demographic variables, certainly, that affect conformity. They're not huge. We don't see large effects here, but they do factor in a little bit. Conformity we see decreases as we get older. That makes sense. As we get older, hopefully we get wiser and we trust our judgments better than we do when we're young. Peers versus parents. These variables are negatively related as conformity to parents decreases, conformity to peers increases, and that's what we see happen. In terms of gender, women conform more in group situations than when by themselves. And research suggests that this is largely due to the cultural and social expectations placed on women. We have, especially here in America, women are expected to foster interpersonal relationships. They encourage harmony within the group, and that's often accomplished through giving in to the group. So you're going to see women conform more in public when they're in that group setting, but when it comes to privately, they actually don't conform as much to their privately held beliefs. They'll hang on to and they won't budge. But when it's something that deals with public or group conformity, they will. And this gender effect does depend, though, on how comfortable people are with a given task. When faced with unfamiliar material, again, people are more likely to go with the group, and that applies to both men and women. There's no gender difference there. So this finding isn't true in all circumstances. We are also influenced to conform. So we talked about some social norms earlier in the last lecture burst. This influences the chances that we're going to conform. So let's take a look at some of those. First, we have normative social influence. This is our need to be liked and accepted by others. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and make changes in our behavior to conform to what others' expectations are of us. Now, obviously, that differs from individual to individual. Remember that the reasons for going along with social norms have to do with fitting in and expectations and all of that. For some people, fitting in is really important. For others, not so much. Informational social influence deals with our need to have a correct perception about our social world. We're trying to gain information about what is the right thing to do, how should I act, and so we use others in this kind of situation as our source of information. When we have to make a political decision, we might not know how we feel about a particular party or candidate, and so what we might do is collect some information. We might see, well, how are my friends voting, or what do my parents think, or what's being talked about at school? And we might use those sources as information that's going to influence how we act. And so we see this as being highest in situations when we feel uncertain. So informational social influence is when we turn to members of a group to obtain accurate data, and normative social influences when we go along with a group for the acceptance of that group. So here's kind of the two pitted against one another, seeking information or striving to be accepted, right? And I've kind of outlined in informational social influence, it's going to happen more with ambiguous situations, the desire and need to get information right away, like you don't have a lot of time to make a decision, when immediate action is necessary, and when we're afraid and need to ease our fear. So emotions really come into play with informational social influence. Our emotions can affect that greatly. And this type of social influence is going to lead more to private conformity. We're going to conform within what we feel is right. Whereas normative social influence happens more so when we're meeting new people, like at a party. We're not familiar with those around us, when we want to be accepted, when we're seeking approval. And so this is going to lead more to public conformity. Culture plays a role, as I said, with collectivistic cultures. We see higher conformity rates. In individualistic cultures like our own, we see lower conformity rates. But remember that these are generalizations and not absolute rules. So it depends on the situation too. Remember that? And it depends upon what's happening in the world, and it depends upon who you're around. Those are all factors that can affect it. Okay, so in the next podcast, we're going to cover compliance, but I just wanted to finish with ways in which we might resist conformity. It's been shown by research that we're more likely to resist conforming when we value our individuality. We have a desire to be distinct from others. We have a desire to have more personal control. We don't want to put our decisions in the hands of others. We appreciate our own decision making. And even if one wants to conform, sometimes we might not be able to. We might be compelled not to conform because of a law or a rule or something that exists to prevent us from doing so. So that can definitely factor in too. We want personal freedom and want to maintain control over our lives, as well as have a strong